You've spent decades becoming who you are, building an identity, establishing yourself through roles, achievements, relationships. You know who you are, or at least you thought you did. But then midlife arrives, and suddenly the person you've been doesn't quite fit anymore. The career that once defined you feels hollow. The relationships that structured your life feel strained. The values you built your world around start to feel like someone else's values, inherited and never questioned. And you're left with a disturbing realization: you don't actually know yourself. Not really. You know the version of yourself you constructed to meet expectations. You know the identity you performed to earn approval. You know the roles you filled to maintain stability. But beneath all of that, who are you? What do you actually want? What do you believe when no one's watching? Most people avoid these questions because they're terrifying. Because self-understanding in midlife doesn't just add information, it dismantles everything you thought was solid. It forces you to confront the gap between who you've been pretending to be and who you actually are. And that gap, it's where your real life has been waiting all along. Here's the paradox. You've spent your entire adult life trying to know yourself. You've done the personality tests, read the self-help books, gone to therapy, journaled about your feelings. You've analyzed your patterns, your triggers, your childhood wounds. You've worked hard to understand why you are the way you are. So why, after all that effort, does midlife make you feel like a stranger to yourself? Why does it feel like everything you thought you knew about your identity was wrong? The answer is uncomfortable. Most of what you called self-knowledge wasn't actually knowledge. It was justification. It was the story you told to make sense of the choices you'd already made. The identity you defended to convince yourself and others that you were living the right life. You weren't discovering who you were. You were constructing who you needed to be to survive your circumstances. And that construction worked. For years, maybe decades, it worked. You showed up as the person your family needed, the professional your career demanded, the partner your relationship required. You adapted, compromised, performed. And somewhere along the way, you started believing that the performance was you, that the roles you played were your identity, that the mask you wore for so long had become your face. But midlife has a way of stripping away performances. The kids leave and you're no longer defined by parenthood. The career ends or stalls and you're no longer defined by professional success. The marriage shifts or ends and you're no longer defined by partnership. And without those external structures holding your identity in place, you're left with a terrifying question. Who am I when I'm not performing for anyone? This is where the real paradox lives. The very thing that makes midlife so disorienting, the loss of external identity markers, is also what makes true self-understanding possible for the first time. Because you can't know yourself while you're constantly adapting to meet other people's needs. You can't understand your authentic desires while you're busy fulfilling obligations. You can't discover who you really are while you're performing who you think you should be. Self-understanding requires space, silence, the uncomfortable absence of roles and expectations. And midlife, whether you wanted it or not, creates that space. It strips away the structures you've been hiding behind and forces you to look at what's left. But looking at what's left is terrifying. Because what if there's nothing there? What if you've spent so many years performing that you've lost touch with any authentic self beneath the performance? What if the real you, the person you would have been if you hadn't spent your life meeting expectations, is so buried that you'll never find them? These fears are why most people avoid self-understanding in midlife. They stay busy. They double down on the roles they have left. They throw themselves into new projects, new relationships, new identities that look suspiciously like the old ones. Anything to avoid the silence where real self-knowledge lives. And here's the cruelest part. The people who seem most self-aware often struggle the most with this because they've built an identity around being self-aware. They've told themselves they know who they are because they can articulate their personality type, their attachment style, their childhood patterns. But that kind of knowledge is intellectual. It's information about yourself, not understanding of yourself. True self-understanding isn't knowing why you do what you do. It's knowing what you actually want when all the external pressures are removed. It's recognizing which parts of your identity were chosen and which were imposed. It's distinguishing between the values you genuinely hold and the values you adopted to fit in. And that level of understanding can't be reached through analysis. It can only be reached through honesty. The brutal, uncomfortable, ego-shattering honesty that midlife demands. So you're caught in an impossible bind. You can't move forward without understanding who you actually are. But understanding who you actually are requires dismantling the identity you've spent decades building. It means admitting that much of what you called your personality was just coping. That many of the choices you defended were made out of fear, not desire. That the life you constructed, while functional, might not be the life you actually want. And facing that truth doesn't feel like growth. It feels like failure, like you wasted your life becoming the wrong person. But the truth is more complicated. You didn't become the wrong person. You became the person you needed to be to survive the first half of your life. And now, midlife is asking you to become the person you need to be for the second half. And that person, they're not who you think. Self-understanding in midlife doesn't begin with introspection. It begins with subtraction. Before you can know who you actually are, you have to strip away who you've been pretending to be. And that's harder than it sounds, because the roles you've played, the identities you've performed, the masks you've worn, they're not just external. They've become part of your internal landscape. You've told the story of who you are so many times that you believe it. You've justified your choices so thoroughly that they feel like authentic expressions of self rather than adaptations to circumstance. So the first step toward real self-understanding is radical honesty. Not the comfortable honesty where you acknowledge your flaws while secretly believing they make you interesting, but the uncomfortable honesty where you admit that much of what you call your identity was constructed out of necessity, not choice. Start by asking questions you've been avoiding, not abstract psychological questions about your inner child or your attachment style. Concrete, present tense questions about your actual life. Do you like your job, or do you just like the security it provides? Do you enjoy your daily routine, or do you just tolerate it because changing feels too hard? Are your friendships genuinely nourishing, or are they habitual connections you maintain out of obligation? Do you believe the things you say you believe, or are you repeating values you absorbed from family, culture, religion without ever examining whether they're actually yours? These questions don't have easy answers, and that's the point. Self-understanding isn't about confirming what you already think. It's about discovering what's true when you stop defending yourself. One of the most powerful tools for self-understanding is noticing your resistance. Pay attention to the moments when you feel defensive, when you rush to justify yourself, when you deflect or rationalize. Those moments are where your constructed identity is protecting itself from examination. Someone suggests you seem unhappy in your marriage, and you immediately list all the reasons your marriage is fine. Someone questions your career path, and you launch into an explanation of why this job makes sense. Someone asks what you really want, and you freeze, unable to answer without referencing what you should want or what would be practical. That resistance isn't protecting the truth. It's protecting the story. And self-understanding requires letting that story crack open. Another approach is to examine your resentments. Not the obvious ones, the daily irritations and frustrations everyone experiences, but the deep, chronic resentments you've been carrying for years. Resentment is almost always a sign that you've been betraying yourself, that you've been saying yes when you meant no, that you've been accommodating someone else's needs while neglecting your own, that you've been living according to values that aren't actually yours. When you feel resentment toward your partner, it's often because you've been performing a version of yourself in the relationship that doesn't match who you are. When you feel resentment toward your job, it's because you've been sacrificing something essential to meet external demands. Resentment is your authentic self trying to get your attention, and if you can listen to it without immediately justifying or dismissing it, it will tell you exactly where you've been lying to yourself. Self-understanding also requires solitude. Not the kind of solitude where you're scrolling your phone or binge-watching shows, but real solitude. Silence. Time alone with your own thoughts without distraction or entertainment. This is where most people falter, because solitude is uncomfortable. When you stop filling every moment with noise and activity, you start hearing the voice you've been drowning out. The voice that questions whether you're living the right life. The voice that wonders who you would have become if you'd made different choices. The voice that asks what you actually want instead of what you think you should want. That voice is terrifying because it doesn't care about your justifications. It doesn't care about practicality or responsibility or other people's expectations. It only cares about truth. And truth, when you've spent decades avoiding it, feels dangerous. But here's what happens when you start creating space for that voice. You begin to distinguish between your authentic desires and your conditioned responses. You realize that some of the things you thought you wanted were actually things you were taught to want. That some of your deepest fears aren't about what might happen. They're about what other people might think. That some of your most defended beliefs aren't beliefs at all. They're tribal affiliations, ways of signaling belonging to a group. And as you start peeling back those layers, you get closer to something real. Not a fixed, permanent self, but a more honest relationship with who you are in this moment. Self-understanding in midlife also means confronting the gap between your ideal self and your actual self. For decades, you've probably been living as if those two things were the same. You've told yourself you're a certain kind of person, generous, disciplined, adventurous, whatever, and you've interpreted your behavior through that lens. But midlife asks you to look at your actual behavior without the interpretive filter. If you say you value deep connection, but all your relationships are surface level, what does that tell you? If you say you're open-minded, but you avoid anything that challenges your worldview, what's the truth? If you say you want to live authentically, but you're constantly performing for approval, who are you actually serving? These contradictions aren't moral failings. They're information, and self-understanding requires treating them as such instead of defending against them. One of the hardest truths to accept is that much of your identity was built around avoiding pain. You developed certain traits not because they were authentic, but because they kept you safe. You became the responsible one because chaos felt threatening. You became the peacemaker because conflict felt dangerous. You became the achiever because worthlessness felt unbearable. And these adaptations worked. They protected you. They helped you survive. But they're not the same as your true self. They're protective layers. And midlife is the moment when those layers start to feel suffocating instead of safe. When the identity that once protected you now imprisons you. And understanding that distinction between protection and authenticity is essential. Self-understanding also requires examining your relationship with approval. How much of your identity is built around being liked, around being seen as competent, successful, good? When you make decisions, are you choosing what feels right to you, or are you choosing what will maintain your image? When you express opinions, are they genuinely yours, or are they calculated to position you within a social hierarchy? These questions aren't about judging yourself. They're about seeing clearly. Because as long as your identity is oriented around external approval, you'll never know who you are when no one's watching. And that person, the one who exists when no one's watching, is the person you've been searching for. Another dimension of self-understanding is recognizing your patterns across time. Not just your current patterns, but the themes that have repeated throughout your life. Do you consistently choose relationships where you have to prove your worth? Do you repeatedly find yourself in situations where you feel responsible for other people's emotions? Do you habitually sacrifice your needs for others and then feel resentful? These patterns aren't random. They're expressions of core beliefs you hold about yourself and the world. Beliefs like, I'm only valuable if I'm useful, or conflict means rejection, or my needs don't matter as much as other people's. And until you identify these underlying beliefs, you'll keep recreating the same dynamics under different circumstances. Self-understanding means seeing the pattern, not just the individual instances. It also means getting honest about your relationship with control. Midlife strips away your ability to control outcomes the way you used to. Your body doesn't respond to willpower anymore. Your children make their own choices regardless of your guidance. Your career doesn't follow the trajectory you planned. And in that loss of control, you have an opportunity to see how much of your identity was built around the illusion of control. Were you actually confident, or were you just in an environment where you could predict outcomes? Were you actually secure, or did you just have enough resources to insulate yourself from uncertainty? Self-understanding requires admitting that much of what you called strength was actually just favorable circumstances, and the person you are when circumstances aren't favorable. That's who you need to understand now. As you move deeper into self-understanding, something unexpected happens. You start to feel lighter. Not because your problems have been solved, but because you stop carrying the weight of a false identity. You stop defending choices that were never really yours. You stop justifying a life that doesn't fit. And in that release, there's space. Space to experiment. Space to try on different versions of yourself. Space to admit that you don't know who you'll become. And that's okay. Self-understanding doesn't give you a fixed destination. It gives you clarity about where you've been and permission to go somewhere different. And here's the most surprising part. As you understand yourself more clearly, you become less attached to any single version of yourself. You realize that identity is fluid, that you're not one fixed thing that needs to be discovered and then protected forever. You're a process, a constantly evolving response to life. The person you were at 20 served a purpose. The person you became at 40 served a different purpose. And the person you're becoming now. They don't have to be consistent with either of those versions. They just have to be honest. And that honesty, that willingness to keep evolving, keep questioning, keep letting go of what no longer fits, is the deepest form of self-understanding there is. When you commit to real self-understanding in midlife, the first thing that changes is your relationship with guilt. For years, you've probably felt guilty about wanting things that don't fit your constructed identity. Guilty for being unhappy when you should be grateful. Guilty for questioning choices everyone told you were right. Guilty for not being the person you promised you'd be. But self-understanding dissolves that guilt. Not because it gives you permission to be selfish, but because it helps you see that guilt was never about morality. It was about betraying an identity that was never fully yours to begin with. When you understand that much of your life was built around meeting expectations rather than honoring truth, guilt transforms into clarity. You stop apologizing for being human. You stop punishing yourself for outgrowing versions of yourself that no longer fit. Your relationships change too. Not always in comfortable ways. Some relationships were built on your performance, on the version of yourself you presented to maintain connection. And when you stop performing, those relationships strain or end. But what replaces them is more real. You start attracting people who respond to your authenticity instead of your accommodation. People who don't need you to be a certain way to feel comfortable around you. People who can handle your complexity, your contradictions, your evolution. And the relationships that survive your transformation, they deepen. Because when you stop hiding, other people feel safer being honest too. Self-understanding creates permission for others to drop their masks. And suddenly, you're having conversations you've never had before. Real ones. The kind that make you feel less alone. You also develop a different relationship with decisions. Before self-understanding, every decision felt massive because you were trying to make choices that would protect an identity you weren't sure was real. You second-guessed yourself constantly. You analyzed every option from every angle, paralyzed by the fear of choosing wrong. But when you understand yourself, when you know what actually matters to you beneath the conditioning, decisions become simpler. Not easier, but simpler. Because you have a clearer internal compass. You know what aligns with who you're becoming and what doesn't. You stop needing external validation to confirm that you're making the right choice. You trust yourself in a way you never could when you were performing for approval. Your tolerance for inauthenticity drops dramatically. Things you used to tolerate, small talk that goes nowhere, relationships that feel transactional, work that feels meaningless, become unbearable. Not because you've become judgmental, but because you've tasted what it feels like to live honestly and you can't go back. You start saying no more often, not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. You stop filling your calendar with obligations that drain you. You stop saying yes to things you don't want to do just to avoid disappointing people. You stop performing enthusiasm for things that bore you. And while this might make you less convenient to others, it makes you more available to yourself. And that availability is what allows you to build a life that actually fits. You also gain the ability to hold paradoxes. Before self-understanding, you needed everything to be consistent. You needed your past choices to make sense. You needed your beliefs to be coherent. You needed a single, unified narrative about who you are. But self-understanding reveals that you're not that simple. You can love someone and still need to leave them. You can regret choices and still honor the reasons you made them. You can be grateful for your life and still want it to change. You can hold grief and joy simultaneously. These contradictions used to feel like evidence that something was wrong with you, but now you see them as evidence that you're complex, that you're human, and that complexity, instead of being something to resolve, is something to accept. Perhaps most importantly, you stop living in the future. For decades, you've probably been oriented toward who you'll become once you figure everything out. Once you reach the next milestone, once you achieve the next goal, once you finally feel settled. But self-understanding teaches you that there is no final destination, no moment when you'll be complete. You're always evolving, always discovering new layers, always outgrowing previous versions of yourself. And instead of that feeling frustrating, it becomes liberating. You stop postponing your real life until you've become the right person. You start living now as whoever you are in this moment, with all your unresolved questions and contradictions. And that shift from waiting to living changes everything. Over time, you notice that you're less reactive. Situations that used to trigger intense emotional responses now feel manageable. Not because you've become numb or detached, but because you understand what's actually happening beneath the trigger. You recognize when you're defending an old identity instead of responding to present reality. You see when your reaction is about an unmet need from childhood rather than the current situation. And that awareness creates space. Space to choose how you respond instead of being hijacked by patterns you didn't choose. Self-understanding doesn't eliminate your emotional life. It gives you agency within it. And that agency is what allows you to stop repeating the same cycles and start creating new ones. You don't need to have yourself figured out. That's the lie you've been carrying. That self-understanding means arriving at a final, complete version of yourself that never changes. But the truth is more freeing than that. Self-understanding isn't a destination. It's a practice, a commitment to keep asking honest questions even when the answers are uncomfortable. A willingness to let go of identities that no longer fit even when letting go feels like loss. A refusal to perform for approval even when authenticity costs you relationships. It's the ongoing work of distinguishing between who you've been told to be and who you actually are. And that work never ends because you never stop evolving. Midlife isn't asking you to become someone new. It's asking you to stop being someone you never truly were, to strip away the layers of performance, adaptation, and self-betrayal that you accumulated over decades, to let yourself be seen, really seen, without the masks you've worn for so long. And yes, that's terrifying, because you don't know who you'll be without those masks. You don't know if the real you is worthy of love, respect, belonging. But here's what you discover when you finally take the risk: you were always worthy. The performance was never necessary. It just felt necessary because you didn't know any other way to survive. But you're not just surviving anymore. You're living, and living requires truth. So stop defending the identity you built in your 20s and 30s. Stop justifying choices that no longer serve you. Stop pretending you're fine when you're not. Let midlife dismantle what needs to be dismantled. Let self-understanding reshape your identity into something more honest, more complex, more yours. You won't recognize yourself when it's done. And that's the point. Because the person you're becoming isn't the person you were trying to be. They're the person you always were beneath the performance. And they've been waiting for you to finally pay attention